Welcome back. In addition to reading the yellow wallpaper this week, we're also going to be reading a series of secondary sources as part of what Charters calls a case study on Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And so I wanted to give you some background on how to read secondary sources. First, let's define our terminology. Whenever we're studying a work of literature, whether it's William Carlos Williams' use of force, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, or Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, the work itself is called the primary source. So when we talk about Gilman, we'll talk about the yellow wallpaper as a primary source document. Any other sources that you might study in order to better understand that primary source document is called a secondary source. And you're already familiar with using secondary sources because that's what you did in your first writing project. In that case, you used the dictionary as your secondary source. So, in our case study on Gilman, we have four different documents. The first is a 1913 essay by Gilman entitled Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper. And the second is a 1935 essay, also by Gilman, called Undergoing the Cure for Nervous Prostration. And nervous prostration is another word for neurasthenia or nerve exhaustion. In addition, there's also two essays by professional literary scholars. The first is Elaine Showalter's essay on the yellow wallpaper, which is a biographical account of the events that led Gilman to write this short story. And then after that, Showalter offers us an interpretation of what she thinks the purpose of the fiction was. And then the second essay is by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, and it's called A Feminist Reading of Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. And this is the more complicated of those two essays by professional scholars. Gilbert and Gubar are feminist scholars, so they're interested in the history of women's oppression. In particular, they're interested in the way that culture has historically shored up economic and social structures that have led to this oppression. For example, the culture that encourages women to behave passively and obediently, and then disciplines the women who don't behave this way. So I'll give you an example to illustrate what I mean. In the Renaissance, women who spoke out of turn, in particular who spoke harshly to their husbands, um, uh, could be punished by the local community. And the local community would force them to wear something called a scold's bridle, which was essentially an iron bridle that would fit around their face, and they would be forced to walk in the public square or stand in the public square wearing this bridle. And so what that is essentially the culture has prescribed that women need to be obedient, and they've also created a system to discipline women who aren't. And that system is both, in that case, a physical object of torment, and then also the shame of having to stand up in front of other people. So these are the kinds of things that Gilbert and Gubar study. The Gilbert and Gubar essay is really complicated. It's very confusing, so don't be alarmed if you had difficulty understanding it. You're not the only one. Um, but to me, there's a couple of key points that stand out that I'd like you to pay attention to. First, Gilbert and Gubar open by noting that female writers often use stories about confinement as a way of commenting on their own cultural and social oppression. So, for example, a female writer might create a story where a heroine is confined in a physical space, like a prison or an attic, an insane asylum, or a bedroom. And that writer may actually pay a lot of attention to the heroine's feelings about her confinement. So, in that case, then the writer can use physical confinement as a way of commenting on the character's social confinement. That is, the way in which the culture that surrounds that character ends up limiting what that character can do and say, and how she can behave, and how she can imagine herself. So, what Gilbert and Gubar argue is that this is precisely what Gilman's done in her story. That is, that Gilman has created a story in the yellow wallpaper in which the heroine's physical confinement in that yellow room parallels her experience of being mentally and socially confined because of her gender. So, what they point out is at the beginning of the story, the heroine is obviously a bright person, but she's given conditioned to accept the authority and the expertise of her husband and her brother. So, her husband and her brother then function as the torchbearers of a society at large, a society which deems her and her nervousness a problem, and then seeks to discipline her for having emotions outside of what they consider to be a normal range. So many people have interpreted the yellow wallpaper as being a really tragic story that ends in this moment where the husband's treatment has gone so horribly wrong that it's actually pushed his wife into full scale loss of reality. But Gilbert and Gubar, by contrast, argue that the ending can be read as a moment of feminist triumph, where the heroine no longer follows the dictates of society, but gives full range to her emotions and her thoughts. And they see this actually reflected in the fact that the heroine describes herself as having been freed from the wallpaper, as having freed this sort of female other, or this female doppelganger from the wallpaper. So, what can we do with this interpretation? Um, well, we can use this and any interpretation as a jumping off point for our own understanding of the text. And we can do typically three things when we're looking at another work of interpretation or another person's interpretation. We can agree with it, we can disagree with it, or we can be of two minds about it. That is, we can accept some of the interpretation's premises but reject others. So I've created a discussion board question for you guys in which I ask you to respond to Gilbert and Gubar's argument. If you choose to write on this question, you can use these three intellectual moves that I've just outlined in your response. So you could say something like, I agree with Gilbert and Gubar's argument, and then you could specify what part you agree with. You could say, I disagree with Gilbert and Gubar's argument, and you could specify what piece of it you disagree with. Or you can say, I'm of two minds about Gilbert and Gubar's argument, and you can point out the things with which you agree and then the things with which you disagree. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to hearing your responses on the discussion board.